Edward had spent the better part of the afternoon in his garage organizing tools and locking his equipment before winter set in. It was a typical Saturday for him, taking care of his property the way any homeowner would. The sun was lowering behind the trees, casting a warm golden hue across his driveway. With a satisfied sigh, he hit the button on the wall and the heavy garage door began to close. As the door slowly lowered, Edward noticed movement out of the corner of his eye from his side vision. He saw a figure standing in the doorway of his neighbor Karen's house. She had been watching him from her porch, arms crossed, lips tightened. Edward didn't think much of it at first. Neighbors being curious was nothing new. But then Karen stepped off her porch and marched toward him with determination. Her approach was swift, her eyes narrowing with doubt. Edward barely had time to acknowledge her before she started her accusation. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Karen's voice was sharp and laced with a mix of disrespect and disbelief. Edward, a man accustomed to keeping his composure, glanced up at her, his expression neutral. "I'm just closing my garage, Karen. I live here, remember?" His tone was calm, devoid of any aggression. But he couldn't ignore the underlying tension in the air. Karen's eyes flickered with distrust and her mouth tightened. "I know who lives here. You're up to something. I've seen people like you do things in this neighborhood before, and I'm not." Letting it slide, before Edward could respond, Karen's fingers were already reaching for her phone. Without a word, she began dialing 911, her gaze never leaving him. 911. "What's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice echoed from the phone. "There's a suspicious man in my neighborhood, right in front of my house," Karen said, her voice filled with urgency. "He's acting strange, lurking around, and I don't know what he's doing here. You need to send someone." The dispatcher, perhaps, sensing the strangeness in Karen's voice, hesitated, but still confirmed. They'd send officers to investigate the call. Edward shook his head, a deep breath escaping his lips. He had seen his share of unease in the neighborhood before, but this felt different. Something about Karen's quick decision to involve the police seemed out of place. He wasn't even sure why she was so intent on causing a disturbance. As the call ended, Edward stood in the driveway waiting for the police. But his mind couldn't shake the feeling of being unjustly singled out. He had lived in this house for years. Never once had he faced any real issues with neighbors, yet now, he found himself in the position of being accused without reason. His grip on the garage door remote tightened as he glanced toward Karen, who had already stormed back into her house, leaving him with a lingering sense of discomfort. What was behind her outburst? Just as the first police car turned the corner, Edward could feel the weight of the situation settling in. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just closing his garage. Something any homeowner would do, but Karen's call to 911 had already set the scene. And now, he had to face whatever came next. He hoped the police would see the reality, but in that moment, he realized that people like Karen didn't always care about the facts. They just cared about authority. The squad car pulled up with the familiar screech of its tires against the pavement. The police officer stepped out, scanning the street before focusing on Edward. He could feel his heart rate pick up slightly as they approached, but he held his ground, keeping his posture straight and his hands visible. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He just needed to make sure the officers understood that. One officer, a tall man with a serious face, approached first, his eyes scanning Edward before turning to the garage. He spoke in a professional tone. "Is everything okay here? We got a call about doubtful activity." Edward's chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I live here," he said, gesturing to the driveway and the garage behind him. "I was just closing my garage after finishing some work. That's all." The officer's brow creased for a moment as he looked over at the closed garage door and back at Edward. He clearly didn't see anything out of the usual. The second officer, a woman, stood off to the side, eyeing Karen's house with a suspicious eyebrow. "Do you have any identification or proof of ownership?" the first officer asked, his tone still neutral but inquiring. Edward nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out his driver's license and his property ownership documents. He handed them over without delay, knowing this would clear everything up. The officers glanced over the documents, their doubt melting into a slight nod of understanding. The woman officer took a step closer, raising her radio to request further verification of Edward's property ownership. Moments later, the confirmation came through, and the officers exchanged an uneasy glance. It was clear now that Edward was in. "The right looks like everything checks out," the male officer said, his voice softer now, but his eyes still fixed on Karen's house. "But you might want to have a word with your neighbor here." Karen, who had been standing in the doorway watching from afar, stepped forward with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was flushed with irritation, her mouth opening to say something, but the officer cut her off before she could speak. "Ma'am, we verified that this is Mr. Edwards' property, and there's no reason to believe anything doubtful is going on. We'd appreciate it if you wouldn't make calls like this unless there's a legitimate emergency." Karen's lips tightened in annoyance, but she said nothing. As the officers turned to leave, the male officer gave Edward a compassionate look, offering a quick "have a good day, sir," before both officers got back into their car and drove away. As the squad car disappeared around the corner, Edward stood still, breathing deeply. The initial tension that had clenched his chest began to ease. He had been wrongfully accused, but the truth had won. Still, the whole interaction left a bitter taste in his mouth. He glanced back at Karen's house and wondered what had driven her to make such a call. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time she would try to make problems for him. In the silence that followed, Edward walked back toward his house, the weight of the incident hanging in the air. Edward sat at his kitchen table late into the evening, scrolling through the public records and online archives. He couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's strange actions and constant attempts to cause trouble weren't just a matter of attitude. There was something more to it, something deeper, and he was determined to figure out what it was. At first, his search yielded little. Karen's name appeared in local news stories, but most of them were about minor neighborhood squabbles or grievances. However, as he dug deeper into older reports, a trend began to emerge. Edward found mention of a string of small thefts tied to a woman named Karen Woodson. Karen's full name. It didn't seem like much at first, but Edward couldn't ignore the sense that this might be just the tip of the problem, so he pressed on. Edward spent hours digging through public police records, court filings, and online forums, piecing together a history of Karen's past that sent a chill down his spine. What he uncovered startled him to his core. Karen wasn't just a disgruntled neighbor. She had a long record of criminal actions. Her small thefts had escalated over the years, eventually leading to serious charges. Assault, fraud, and even involvement in organized crime were linked to her name. As he read through police reports, Edward's eyes widened. Karen had been arrested multiple times for violent crimes and had spent time in jail, but much of her record had mysteriously been removed. There were hints of deals made, whispers of corruption, and the understanding that she had likely never been fully held accountable for her past. A tip from a neighbor sent Edward down a darker path. According to the neighbor, Karen had once been associated with a notorious gang that had been involved in a series of high-profile crimes in the area. The group was linked to smuggling, fraud, and violent intimidation tactics. Karen had apparently been one of their enforcers doing the dirty work, while remaining in the shadows. But what struck Edward the hardest was the discovery of her ties to hate groups. She had been involved in organizing and participating in rallies where racist chants and violence were commonplace. One particular event, which had resulted in arrests and widespread media attention, stood out. Karen had been there, leading slogans and confronting protesters. What struck Edward the hardest was the realization that her deep-seated hatred wasn't just confined to isolated incidents. It was a part of who she was. It was this same hatred, it seemed, that had driven her to target him. He wasn't just a wrong person in her eyes. He was a symbol of everything she loathed. Her harassment wasn't random. It was a personal, calculated attack stemming from years of built-up racism and bitterness. Sitting back in his chair, Edward felt a rush of both anger and sadness. Karen's past was now laid bare, and he understood the true seriousness of her actions. The woman he had thought Knowledge he had to make sure Karen could no longer prey on him or anyone else in the neighborhood. The very next day, Edward was out in his driveway bringing in the trash cans after the weekly pickup. The sun was shining, the air crisp with the chill of autumn, and it seemed like another quiet day in the neighborhood. But Edward couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was lurking nearby. Sure enough, as he moved the cans toward the garage, he saw her emerge from her front door, stepping out onto the porch with that same cold look of distrust plastered on her face. This time Karen didn't wait long before storming across the yard toward him, her fists clenched by her sides. She was shouting as soon as she was within earshot, accusing him of threatening her. "You've been watching me," Karen yelled, her voice shrill and trembling with false fury. "You got way too close to my property yesterday, and now feel threatened. You better stay off my lawn, or I'll make sure the police hear about this." Edward blinked, taken aback. He had barely even glanced in her direction, let alone gotten close to her property. His confusion quickly gave way to frustration as Karen continued to accuse him of bothering her. "Karen, I'm just putting the trash cans away," Edward said, trying to stay calm despite the wild accusations being thrown at him. "You're overreacting again." But Karen wasn't having it, her face contorted with anger as she pulled out her phone, already dialing 911 without hesitation. "911? What's your emergency?" the dispatcher answered, her voice clearly puzzled by the sudden urgency in Karen's tone. "There's a black man disturbing me," Karen shouted into the phone. "He came too close to my property, and I feel threatened. He's been doing this every day. He's dangerous. You need to send someone right now." The dispatcher, sounding frustrated but trying to maintain professionalism, asked for more details. "Ma'am, is the person still on your property?" "Yes, he's right there," Karen snapped, pointing at Edward, who stood there in shock. "He's been watching me for days. I don't trust him." Edward stood still, his eyes wide. Knowing he had to stay calm, he didn't want to escalate the situation, but the sheer boldness of Karen's words was infuriating. The dispatcher seemed familiar with Karen's name, the edge of doubt in her tone evident. "Ma'am, we've had multiple calls about this same individual, and we'll send officers to check things out, but please make sure your claims are truthful." Despite the dispatcher's attempt to control the situation, Karen's grip on her phone tightened. As she waited for the officers to arrive, Edward, now fully aware that this was yet another groundless attack, prepared himself for what was coming. He could already hear sirens in the distance. This time he knew he had to be ready with the knowledge of Karen's criminal history fresh in his mind. He wasn't going to let her get away with another false report. He had already decided he was going to set the record straight once and for all. The sirens grew louder as the officer's car pulled up. In front of Edward's home, he could feel the familiar knot of frustration building in his chest. But this time, he was determined not to let Karen's baseless accusations slide. He had already gathered the facts, and now it was time to reveal the truth. Edward stood firm as the officer approached, and with a calm but firm voice, he began his explanation. "Officer, this is the second time in as many days that Karen has called the police on me for no reason." Edward began, his words steady and clear. He recounted the first incident with the garage, describing how Karen had misunderstood his actions and created a story that had led to the police wasting valuable resources. The officer, a seasoned professional, nodded in agreement, but Edward could see that the officer was uncertain. He could tell that Karen's behavior might just be a case of an overzealous neighbor, but Edward wasn't about to let this go, especially now that he knew more about Karen's troubling past. "I've done some research, officer," Edward continued calmly, pulling out the documents he had discovered online. "Karen's past isn't just limited to small neighborhood disputes. She has a history of criminal actions, assault, fraud, theft, and even ties to organized crime. She's been involved in more serious offenses, and there are records showing her involvement in hate groups." The officer raised an eyebrow as he flipped through the papers Edward had handed him. The officer had seen his fair share of harassment claims and false reports, but this was different. The officer wasn't gullible. He could see the weight of Edward's words, and the honesty. In his eyes, this wasn't just a case of neighborhood friction. It was something deeper. Edward then mentioned the tip from the neighbor who had known Karen in the past. This person had first-hand knowledge of her involvement in gang operations, and the officer took note. The officer stood in silence for a moment, piecing everything together. It was clear to him now. Karen was not just a neighbor with a grudge. She was a woman with a history of using fear and intimidation to control people, and Edward had unknowingly become her next target. When the officer turned to confront Karen, Edward couldn't help but feel a slight sense of relief. He had done his part. Now, the truth was in the open. Karen's act was about to crumble. Karen, seeing the officer approaching, immediately shifted into a defensive posture. She began to rant, denying everything Edward had just revealed. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her face turning red with anger. "He's making all of this up. I've never done anything wrong." Her voice shook, but the officer remained calm. "Ma'am, we have documents showing your involvement in criminal activity," the officer said, his tone steady. "We need to handle these issues." Karen's response was to double down on her false accusations, calling Edward a liar. As her frustration grew, she resorted to something even more telling. She let loose a barrage of racial slurs directed at Edward with poisonous hatred. The officer standing just a few feet away overheard every word. The officer's expression hardened as the full scope of the situation became clear. This wasn't just harassment. It was racially motivated. And now, Karen had just sealed her fate. Her words, as hateful as they were, provided the proof. The officer needed to move forward. The officer turned to Edward, giving him a nod of support. It was time to end this. The air was thick with tension as the officer, now fully aware of Karen's past and her unprovoked hostility toward Edward, placed her under arrest. "Ma'am, I'm arresting you on charges of filing false police reports, harassment, and hate speech," the officer stated. His voice was firm, but there was an unmistakable sense of finality this time. Karen's rule of terror was coming to an end. Karen's face contorted in shock. "You can't do this. I haven't done anything wrong," she screamed, struggling as the officer handcuffed her. "You're making a wrong move." But the officer wasn't backing down. As he placed her in the back of the patrol car, the full extent of Karen's criminal acts started to unravel. Investigators would later uncover even more evidence tying her to a series of fraud schemes, violent incidents, and a history of racial prejudice. What Edward had discovered had only been the tip of the iceberg. Karen had been using her position in the neighborhood to frighten others, knowing that her reputation as a well-regarded neighbor would protect her from suspicion. But her mask had shattered and the truth had come to light. The news of Karen's arrest spread quickly throughout the community, and the reactions were immediate. Neighbors who had once feared her or tolerated her outbursts began to speak up. Many admitted that they had noticed her behavior before, but had either been too afraid or too hesitant to act. Now they rallied behind Edward, showing their support for the brave man who had finally exposed Karen's true identity. As the officers drove Karen away, Edward stood on his porch watching as the car disappeared down the street. He had stood up for himself, for his rights, and for the truth. He had fought against the toxic force of racism and hate, and he had prevailed. The relief he felt was strong. He could finally breathe easy. The neighborhood, now fully aware of Karen's criminal history and her despicable deeds, slowly began to turn their backs on her. No longer would they turn a blind eye to her behavior. Justice had been served, not just for Edward, but for everyone who had ever been threatened or silenced by Karen's toxic presence. As Edward looked out over his peaceful neighborhood, he felt a sense of triumph. The battle had been long, but it was worth it. With Karen now gone from the community, Edward knew that he could continue living his life without fear of harassment or revenge. He had made a change, and the ripples of his courage would be felt for years to come.